Hi, welcome to the Getting Started video for painting the Celtic busts. This is going to be the first video in our Paint-Along series. I'm recording this one rather than it being live. All the future videos are going to be live streamed through Twitch, twitch.tv/gorilla with a brush. But this first one, I'm just going to go over some of the basics of cleaning and prepping the model, priming it, and we're going to get the first base coat down in the flesh. So my hope is that each of you who bought these busts to participate in the paint along is going to also get the models essentially to the same point. So you're going to have it assembled, you're going to have it cleaned, primed, and have the base coat down on the flesh when we get started with that next session. I'll be posting this on all my social media, so you probably got it from there, got the links from there. If you haven't ordered these busts yet, so you're just coming to this video without knowing what we're doing, so what we're going to participate in is a weekly paint-along where we're going to work together on the progress on these Celtic bust models. So we'll start with doing flesh tones, we'll move on to the clothing and the plaid, the leather armor, the hair, and eventually the weapons. If you order these, you can order these off of my website, gorillawithabrush.com. There's a link up at the top that says Celtic Busts. You can click on that. And there's ordering options for depending on whether you live in the United States or whether you live in Europe, Canada, things like that. Shipping's a little bit more internationally. The busts right now are $30 roughly for the pair. I think about $17 for one of them, and then shipping is about $4 if you live in the U.S. and about $10 if you live abroad. Each of the models, when you get them, they're going to come packaged like this. So you'll have each bust will be in its own bag with a little inside bag that has the weapons and the hair, extra little like braids and things for the hair for each of the models. And each of the models also comes with one of these cards, hand numbered. There are only 90 of each of these casts available. So if you are interested in doing this, make sure you don't wait. If they sell out, we're never going to cast them again. In addition, the first 5, so numbers 1 through 5 of the 90 for each model, are going to be ones that I'm painting. So if you are interested in a painted version of this, whether you're participating in the paint along and you painted your own, but then you want the actual model that I painted in hand to kind of see in person some of the different things that I pulled off to maybe then try on the second bust or on another model in the future, so you want one of the painted versions, just let me know. I am selling the painted versions 1 through 5 of each model. They're going to be priced significantly below what I normally charge for commission work, just as part of kind of getting the ball rolling and getting word out about these models, and hopefully we can make sure that they sell out in a timely manner. So if you are a seasoned modeler, some of the stuff that I go over today is going to seem like old hat. Feel free to fast forward through any of the parts that don't pertain to you, but I'm going to start just with the basics and we're going to move from there. So when you're working with these models, if you've never worked with a resin model before, there's a couple things to know. First of all, the resin is fairly soft. It's much softer than hard plastic, like something that like Games Workshop makes their models out of, for instance. So you want to be really careful when you're working on them with a knife. The other thing to know is that while model makers generally do this with no matter what the model is, I think I found that it's particularly problematic or important with resin models is that they spray the molds with a mold release agent. That way that the resin doesn't stick to the rubber molds. The problem is then once you get the models, if you rub them, you might feel that there's kind of like a slight residue on your fingers. It's like a greasy WD-40 kind of feel on them. Just like you can imagine, paint doesn't stick to grease very well. So they don't clean the models very well when they come out of these molds. They just pull them out of the molds, let them cool, throw them in the bags. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to clean these models really, really well. You can do that at one of 2 stages or both of the stages. So right when you pull them out of the bag, one of the first things you might want to do is mix up a bowl of not scalding, but just like warm tap water Mix a little Dawn dish soap in there. Throw the models in there, let them soak for a couple minutes, kind of swirl them around. You can, even if you want, take an old toothbrush, give them a nice gentle scrub, and just really wash the model well in warm soapy water. Give it a really good rinse, let it sit to dry for however long. Here in Arizona, it doesn't take all that long. If you live someplace where it's more humid, you might want to give them 24 hours to really make sure every little nook and cranny is totally dry before you prime them. We'll get to priming in a little bit. Then you want to prep the models, clean the models. We'll show cleaning the mold lines in a second. We'll talk about that. But, as you're handling the models that much, you might be getting oil from your fingers all over them. So, you then, after you assemble them, you might want to give them another wash and then let them fully dry before you prime. That's kind of up to you. For the 4 that I'm painting, I didn't do that second step. I just washed them the first time. And then after I cleaned them up, I just primed them from there. Depends how paranoid you are about stuff to stick or how good your primer is. If you've had problems with your primer sticking to models, you want to make sure they're extra clean. So for cleaning the models, in terms of cleaning off the mold lines and stuff, each of the models is going to have essentially this peg that's sticking out of the bottom. So this was the channel in which the resin was injected into the mold from. And so, it's broken off fairly close to the model, but obviously you probably don't want that around. So you need a pair of modeling clippers. You can use just a hobby knife for this, but it's a little bit more of a dangerous process. If you're using a hobby knife, it's kind of a big thick chunk of resin. I thought I had brought my clippers over here. I guess these are my other clippers, so they'll work. So I have the trash receptacle thing here. So you just want to really be gentle and kind of work your clippers in. Don't just go in there and just start clamping off. I find gentle pressure and just kind of work your way into it. And you're not going to be able to get all the way flush with the model. So you will have to do some cleanup later with your hobby knife, but just be gentle. So again, you'll get down to a nub like this. And you want to take your hobby knife and just ever so gently, especially, if you're working the model towards your fingers or the knife towards your fingers, be really careful. Again, I prefer being gentle, going multiple passes rather than trying to just really gouge something out. For a couple reasons. Resin's kind of soft. It's easy to have your knife just all of a sudden slip. Also, just to have a nice clean finish on it, as opposed to, again, some kind of deep gouge in your model. And so just work that down until it's smooth. You'll see there's some other little remnants of mold lines here. You can kind of work those around the same way. You'll also notice there's kind of the start of a little hole here. So the sculptor had wooden pegs that were stuck into those holes when he was sculpting them. Those were then broken off for the mold process. But that's not going to really be a big enough hole to mount your model. These models don't come with their own plinths. You can get little wooden blocks from a hobby store, or just like Michael's, any craft store. You can get wooden blocks if you just kind of want a simple wooden block. You can paint it, stain it, whatever you want. Manufacturers like Dragon Forge will make more display quality plinths out of resin that you can get, and you can paint those. What I'm going to be doing with mine, I found these off Amazon. They're I think they're parts for model airplanes, or like RC airplanes, remote control airplanes, remote control cars, something like that. I think these are axles for those. But they're just metal rods. You can get brass rod, whatever. And then I use a pin vise. Again, you want to be careful using a big powerful drill for something like this, because the resin is soft. You can end up just powering right through the model, or having it slip and cut you, drill into your hand, something like that. I have done that before back in my younger days. So what I would recommend is getting something like a pin vise. If you don't have one of these already, they're really, really good for modeling just in general if you have to pin something. So they're good to have. But you want to get, this is clearly not the right size for this, but you want to get the drill bit that matches the size of what you're going to put in. Carefully drill the hole, making sure that you are going in vertically, both from profile and from front to back. So as I start to drill into these, I will often check. So I'll be drilling in, I'll turn the model 90 degrees, drill some more, turn the model 90 degrees, drill some more. Just go back and forth, making sure I'm going in straight as opposed to, at some kind of weird angle, because then when you mount him, he's going to be at a weird angle. But you don't really have to, get anything fancy like these. Even if you just got a wooden dowel yourself, or again, something like brass rod or whatever, that will work. So you'll need that for mounting your model eventually on whatever you're going to mount it on. Now, in terms of for painting, you've probably seen me use these before. These are the Wrath core holders. I really like them because not only is the model, sitting on something that I can hold that's not the model, but they have these nice bars with a soft rubber skull at the top. So as you need to get fine detail on the model, you have things that you can brace your hands along. They sell these on Amazon. You can also go to PK-Pro. That's a company out of Germany that sells these as well. So if you want them, they're not necessary, but I do really like them. They use these cork holders that just pinch into the wood. So what I like to do for these is I like to use paper clip. So you can see I've drilled that pilot hole for the mounting brackets or the mounting rod I'm going to use later. But I also drilled these two smaller holes with the paper clip, just threaded 2 ends of a clipped paper clip down into it. This way my Wrath core holders allows me to work on the model. When I'm done, I'm going to either do one of two things, depending on how much glue I put in there. I'm either going to just take some pliers and just gently work the paper clips till I can pull them out, or I'll just take my clippers and I'll clip off. What's nice is that they are kind of underneath here. I'll probably finish everything off underneath with just a flat black paint. That way you really aren't going to see, it's not going to draw any attention. It's going to be underneath the model, so it's not going to be a big deal. So a couple options. Now, if you don't want to do any of those things, you just want to paint on this, maybe he's just for practice, you're just working on your skills in this paint along and you're not really that concerned about displaying him later. There's nothing wrong with just getting some blue tack, getting something. So I've seen people have dice boxes, cork, whatever, it doesn't matter. Just take your model, stick it on there, you're good to go. It'll hold, no problem. In fact, like you can see, I'm putting quite a bit of pressure on it, he won't fall. I was pushing on him really hard. If you get him really on there with blue tack, he's not really going to come off while you're painting. It'll be nice and good. It'll be nice and solid for you. So lots of options there. Now, as you continue to work on the mold lines, so you'll notice these, for the most part, these models came out really, really clean. I personally went through each one as I was packing. I had a few extras made. They're not ever going to be sold. I had 100 of each made, but I'm only ever selling 90 of them. The other 10, it was kind of lucky I did that. The last 10 there's something wrong with the casts. I should say I'm not going to sell them as limited edition. If you already bought some of these and you're interested in a really cheap like spare one that you can just practice a couple things on, but knowing that there's some defects to it, like I'd be willing to sell one of you guys extras, but I'm not going to go out and market selling beyond the 90, and they're certainly not going to get limited edition numbers. But anyway, I went through each hand by hand and I picked the best 90 out of them to be sold. So really, I didn't see significant mold slippage, any of them that had a little bit of mushy details, which can happen either near the end of the mold's life or if they spray too much mold release agent in there. So you've got this liquid up against the details of the mold. So when they pour the resin in, it kind of pushes up against the liquid, and so you don't get quite as sharp details in some spots. So any place where I saw that happening significantly, I set those models to the side. And so the best of them are the ones that are being sent out to you guys. So again, I didn't see major problems with them. There are, varying degrees of mold lines on them. Some are better than others, but for the most part, you shouldn't have serious issues. Like for this model, I see there's a, sorry, I'm off camera. It's even hard to see on camera, but one of the mold lines runs right along the inside of this seam. You can't even see it from the front, but from the back you can kind of see it. It kind of runs up from here and up here. So you can just, again, take your hobby knife and just be very gentle. And just work at slowly carving off those mold lines. Kind of runs up along his shoulder here. Down the other side, it runs in the middle of his sleeve. So again, you can just sort of carefully, a little bit at a time, until you're happy. If you make a mistake, you can always get some green stuff or some plastic gap filler or whatever and just put it in there. One thing I will say as a caution, again, if you've never worked with resin models, is that you don't want to breathe in resin dust. It's very, very bad for your lungs. So there's a couple things that you can do. I'm making this video. I can't really put a mask on. If I did, you wouldn't be able to hear me. So I suggest while working with resin models, while you're carving them, like shaping them like that, taking out the mold lines, is to wear a dust mask at the very least, or you can even get a respirator, something that people would use when they're airbrushing. If you don't have those, one of the things you can do is you can just avoid sanding the model. So you want to create as little dust as possible. So if you notice, what I was doing was I didn't have sandpaper. I was using my hobby knife, and I was actually carving in strokes that are going perpendicular to the mold line. I'm just very carefully, slowly carving off. And so the chunks that I get aren't really dust. And so, as they fall, they're just going to fall into my box here. They're not like getting up in the air and being breathable, like what would happen if I just started madly sanding this thing with sandpaper. If you really are getting to a point where that's not quite working, you need to do something like sanding, you can always do scraping. So you take the model or you take the knife and you scrape along the model. Again, the chunks you get from this are a little bit larger. They're less likely to be airborne. They're more likely to just fall into your box, and so it's a little safer. If you really want to sand, or you have no recourse, there's just a stubborn spot on here, then the next best thing to do is to get wet sandpaper and to use the wet sandpaper wetted to then sand the model, because then the water will help to trap the resin dust in the sandpaper, and then you throw it away. And again, it's going to create less airborne material for you to potentially breathe. But really, if the big message here is to be safe, both with using your hobby knife as well as being careful with the resin dust, because no matter how much you love this hobby, it's not worth having a cavalier attitude about safety. So make sure that you are protecting yourself when you're working on these models. The last thing that I'll say here about assembly is that, well, not the last thing, but a few last points. So with the Clan Chieftain here, his braids have a lot of extra resin at the end of them, as does the pommel of his sword. And these were channels down into where the resin was. So with the Clan Chieftain, I have two examples here. One of them, I cut the thing at the base of his pommel, kind of the butt of his sword handle here. I just cut it flush. One of them I left just a little bit extra on top. If you've ever seen one of these swords in person, they tend to have like a little nub at the end of them. It's not as wide as this chunk of resin is, but it's also not flush with the bottom of the pommel. So you could be, if you wanted to, just carefully work down and get a little bit more of a nub. You could cut it flush, you could cut it not quite so flush and have a little bit extra there. It's just kind of personal preference, whatever you want. And then again, clean up the mold lines that are on here, being careful with the resin dust. Similarly with these, you kind of want to cut down to where the braid is, and you should be able to see as you rotate it around, there's a cylinder, and then the cylinder starts getting into the braids. What I would suggest that you do is cut it to where you still have just a little bit of the cylinder left, and then sort of check it up against the model and see how it looks up there. You might feel like you want to go all the way down to just where the braid starts. On the model itself, there's these little hair ties right where it goes down into the braid. So you should be able to go braid right in there, but sometimes it's nice to have a little bit more of a flat surface. Once you start getting the braid, the joint, the connection part's going to get smaller, so the glue might not hold quite as well. So just kind of, cut it down, test fit it, cut it down more if you need to, test fit it. Remember, you can always cut off, but you can't add back very easily. So it's better to take it slow and protect your investment. Now for the model himself, again, he's only got 3 pieces. The other guy has more pieces. You'll see that he's got 2 different braids. One of them has more curl to it. The one with more curl to it is on the left side. Goes onto the left side of him. And I played around a little bit with a couple different ways of having the braid lay, just to see how it looks. So this one comes down a little bit more straight down onto his chest. The bend kind of goes towards the back. And here I turned it a little bit so the bend sort of goes out at an angle a little bit and it lays more along his shoulder. So a couple different options, whichever you like better. Again, what I suggest is just test fitting some things. You can even put a little bit of blue tack where the connection point is and get it in there and start to feel for how it looks before you glue it. And then his other braid, obviously the straighter one goes on the other side. Again, with this one I tried a couple different things, whether I had it more out towards his shoulder or a little bit more down his chest. So whichever look you prefer. I kind of think this one turned out a little bit better. This one, it looks a little unnatural maybe, the way it comes off his face. This one hangs down a little bit straighter, so I kind of like it more towards his like his chest muscle as opposed to out towards his shoulder. But yeah. As far as the sword's concerned, I test fitted it a few different ways. I ended up opting to let the sword be a little bit below, to come down a little bit below the back of the bust. I kind of liked how that looked rather than if I tried to go flush back here, so have the bottom of the sword where it's cut off horizontally be flush with where his torso's cut off. I just thought that the sword handle looked a little high, a little unnaturally high, so I didn't quite like that as much, so I put them down further. But again, test fit it, see what you like. Any other comments on this guy? So the only other thing I'll say is that no, I'll save that. So that's for the Clan Chieftain. The Celtic Warrior, he's got a few more pieces to him. And again, I played around a little bit with some different ways of attaching his 4 different hair braids that he has. I was showing you this card before. This picture was from the sculptor. And this picture is interesting because he has 2 of the braids on there, but 2 of the braids are not attached. So I actually don't have a reference picture for how all 4 of them are supposed to go onto his head and attach. So I was playing around a little bit and wanted to show you what I ended up doing, which I think looks pretty good. And I I settled on putting the braids in these 4 locations. Then I also have 2 different kind of ways I attached them to show you. So I'll say the biggest thing with the Celtic Warrior, well, before I even get into that, you'll notice he's a little different color. That's just this pair of busts. When you work with resin, they're mixed. It's like an epoxy type thing. You know, they mix multiple chemicals together and it creates the resin that will harden as it cools. And just dependent on like how much dye it is or how well mixed the dye is into the resin, things like that, you'll end up with slightly different colorations. It doesn't mean anything. You know, if you get one white, one whiter, one darker, it's just the color of the resin. It's no difference in the quality of the models. So the one tricky thing with him, the trickiest part, and I think this is where you have to be the most delicate. 2 things with him, actually. So the channel down for his axe is actually attached to the top of the axe blade here. And it's a little bit tricky to get off safely, because you don't want to just go in there like really aggressively, because then you might mess up the top part of the axe. So what I suggest doing is kind of going with your clippers this direction and kind of going up along the same direction as the blade. You can also clip off the extra that comes this way first. Again, make sure you're doing it gently. Don't just go in there too aggressively. Kind of little pressure and then ease off. So cut that off. It makes it a little bit more manageable to cut through. Come from this way. Come from this other side. And you can come down towards the blade. And then once you get closer here, then I would suggest going to your hobby knife and finishing that up just very carefully. And when you're getting here at the clippers, you're more likely to slip and then take something off that you don't want. So that's a little bit, just takes a little TLC. And the other thing is his braids. These are very, very fragile pieces. There's very thin resin on each of these. So when you're cleaning up the mold lines, again, just be very gentle. If you're a little too aggressive, you're liable to break the braids. And again, the braids are very fragile. So I would suggest just being very, very careful as you're cutting these with your hobby knife. In terms of when you put them on, again, you'll see with him, I opted to have the bottom of the weapon go a little below the bottom of the bust. I just thought it looked a little too tall when I tried to go flush. And then in terms of where the 4 braids attach, what I found looks best is to start with, or what kind of worked best for me. So start with, here's the 4 pieces that you get. So you'll kind of have this one that's got the widest opening. So I found it worked best to start with this one and attach it on his right side, right there. So basically there's like a little indentation above his braid. So I glued it into there. Again, dry fit it, test out a few different angles, a few different positions for it, but essentially it goes in like this. You can also shape the place, like the nub at the top of it. You can shape it a little bit so that it goes right into that hole, fits flush. You can always come back later as well with green stuff or plastic putty or any of that stuff and fill in any gaps that you get. So glue that in there. You can let it dry if you want. If you're more like confident and you're just like, it's there, I'm not going to worry about it. If I knock it off with other pieces, you can just go with the next one. So the next piece then is this guy. And so what I found with him, with this piece then is, it's got extra resin on it, so you're going to want to clip that off. But then I just slid it up underneath. So I basically slid it up underneath that piece as far as it would go and then let it sit into place. So it kind of looks like this when it's done. So you get some nice different like layers to the braids on that side of his head. On his other side of the head, this one I kind of went in the, I guess they're not really exactly on top of each other. So those two pieces have been used. So the next step is to use this piece. It's got the sort of the fattest braids. They're a little more wide and flat. And so you can kind of see that piece on him right there. So again, he's got a resin nub up here you want to carefully remove. And if you follow the shape, it's kind of at an angle, so it should glue nicely right there, like right along his temple. So it'll sit down like this. Again, dry fit it, see what kind of angle you want, what kind of flare you want with the braids. And then the final last piece, this one, I just glued it like right behind the other braid. So you can see here. So it's just this braid right here. So it just glues in right behind where I put that one in. And so after a lot of dry fitting and testing things out, this is what I found seemed to work the best for the four of them. If you find a different arrangement, by all means, use whatever you like. You can see I opted for a couple different looks. The one on the right here has a little bit more flaring out of the hair on one side. This flares out a little bit more. It's a little flatter on this guy. Almost kind of the opposite on the other side of the face. Again, dry fit it, test it, see what you want, but maybe you can use these as a guide to sort of see how it looks when you try a couple different things. So far the name of the game when you're assembling them is take your time, be careful, protect yourself, test fit things before you glue them in for sure. Now let's talk about priming. So I've decided on this project, I don't use an airbrush a lot. I mostly just use it for priming. Every so often I'll use it for doing a little bit of base coating. But for the most part, I do everything by brush. So I'm going to stick with that here. I was tempted because of the larger surface area of the skin that I wanted to have really smooth. I was tempted to use an airbrush for the skin, but I know that probably a good chunk of the people who are going to be doing this paint along don't have an airbrush. So I did use an airbrush for the primer. And so I'm going to talk a second about the primer color choice. Because somebody was giving me a hard time on Twitter already. They said, well, you've chosen a weird primer color and I'm already lost. Like, you've already lost me. So first of all, I realized I probably should have primed. I usually prime in more of a gray color, which is what I would really recommend if you have an option between sort of white, black, and gray. Just kind of a mid-tone gray is probably best. Black is nice in that it can hide things. So if you get black primer and you get a really nice solid coating of it, then your shadows are all black. So if your color doesn't quite go all the way down into the shadows or whatever, it just kind of hides any imperfections like that. White sort of does the opposite. It's going to magnify any imperfections you have with there. You're going to be able to get brighter colors with the white, whereas the black, some of the stuff's going to take more coats to cover cleanly. Gray is kind of a little bit of a nice balance between the two. I find it really nice and easy to paint over to get good tones, good color tones without, without sacrificing sort of the things I don't like about the white primer. Also, white primer can sometimes go on funny, like the texture of it's not always as good. So I usually like to prime in sort of a medium tone gray, or I use the Badger Stenolrez primers. I think that's how you pronounce it. And so they have like an ochre color, so like a kind of a mustard color, light mustard color primer. I kind of take that and I mix it with a little bit of gray so that I get, not such a neutral gray, but it's a little bit warmer gray as my primer color. That's usually what I use. This is not that. This is the Stenolrez Ebony Flesh primer. And the only reason I opted to do this, and I promise you, the only reason I chose this color was because I was priming other things in that color and I was too lazy to change my primer color. And that was going to be the only things I was priming prior to starting this project. So really, prime in whatever color you want. If you like white, prime in white. If you like black, prime in black. If you like gray, prime in gray. If you have an airbrush and you want to do the exact same thing as me, again, this is the Ebony Flesh Badger Stenolrez primer. But again, there is no particular reason I chose this color other than I don't really like priming in black or white, and this was something in between that I just happen to be using for other projects. So let's get into actually starting to paint a little bit. And I'm not going to get into a ton today because I really want that to be something that we're doing together. But I figure base coating the skin, because base coating can take multiple thin coats if you're doing it right. I really don't want to have the first, hour and a half or 2 hours of our time together live be me just repeatedly putting on smooth, multiple thin layers of a flesh tone color to get a nice thin base coat. So we can all do that on our own, and then we can come later and be able to kind of work together to build up the highlights and the textures and tones and things like that are on the skin that we're going to work together. So today I'm just going to start that process, and I'll do all the other, I'll just have all of the base coats done then off camera. Prior to starting that though, if you have watched my painting eyes video, you'll notice that you'll remember that I have several different techniques for painting eyes, and one of them actually begins prior to you painting any of the face. So what I'm going to do is, on 2 of these models, I'm going to do 2 different options for starting with the eyes, which I think for a lot of beginners who have trouble with eyes, I think this works better. The problem is you have to kind of be careful as you're painting the rest of the face. You can't get glazes and washes and stuff down into the eye sockets because it messes up all the work you've already done. But I'm going to do 2 of these models with the pre-painted eyes, and then 2 of the models I'll do the eyes at the end of the process if that's what you're more interested in seeing. So let me just check something. So to start off with, if we're going to paint the eyes prior to painting the model, so all we need is some white paint. What you might even want to do, I know some people like to do this, I usually just use white, but I don't know, we'll listen to internet wisdom here for the first time. So what they suggest sometimes is to not use pure white, because pure white is very glaring, and the human eye, even if you were to hold up white color chips, for example, you're going to find that your eye is not like bright white. So they suggest a little bit of an off-white or cream color. I don't often paint models in this scale, so usually with the smaller scale, I really don't think it matters. Maybe as you start to get to this scale, maybe it matters a little bit more. So I thinned the paint just a little bit. You don't have to have it too thin for this. It's not that important. And in fact, what's nice about this is you really don't have to be too neat at all. So I'm just going to take some of this off-white. By the way, this was White Sands from Scale Color 75. This would be kind of, if you have other lines of paints, probably Minoff White Highlight is the closest thing off the top of my head I know to what this color is. So I'm just going to fill in the whole eye. And I'm not going to worry about if any white gets outside of that, because I'm going to clean that all up later. Let's just kind of fill the eye. I'm going to go back with a second coat once it's dry, just to make sure I get a nice solid covering here. I actually realized I wasn't really thinking about getting super deep into the painting today, so I don't have any reference pictures loaded. My recollection is Mel Gibson has pretty light blue eyes. So what we'll do is I'll show you with the William Wallace character, I'll do light blue eyes. And with Hamish, I'll just do black in case you're just interested in just more basic approach for this. So for the blue eyes, what I suggest is starting with slightly darker blue. So I'm going to use Mediterranean blue. It's just kind of a mid-tone blue. Something like the old Enchanted blue from GW. I don't really know the new GW colors that well. When they changed their paint line, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, I was starting to switch over to using P3 colors. And then more recently I use scale 75, so I'm not that familiar. And I still have a bunch of the old GW paints I was still working my way through, so I really have only used like 10 or so of the newest colors. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to paint just vertical bars in the center of the eye. Try to get them the same width roughly in each eye. If you mess up, if you find that one of them is a little bit thicker, like I think his right eye might be just a hair thicker, let it dry, and then just go back with this white color and just kind of touch up that side a little bit. While that dries, we'll start working on Hamish. So just take a black paint. We're just going to do the same thing on him. So paint some vertical bars. Try to get them to be roughly the the same width. Now what's nice about this technique too, it's very easy to do eyes that are looking in different directions, not from each other, but like something not head on. So if you put the vertical bar, off to one side of each eye, then it just looks very natural, like the person's looking off to the side. Check on Hamish. He looks fine. Okay, so with looks a little creepy at the moment, I know, but we're gonna go to a lighter color now. So get a lighter blue. So I'm gonna step down to sky blue. And I want to go inside of the darker blue. And I'm going to go one more step down. I'm going to see if I have a blue that's light enough. Probably just add a little bit of white to this. Now you have a couple options at this point for this last light blue. You can just, again, go inside of the medium tone blue you just did. Or what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to try to put a little texture. So like your iris has, a little bit of texture to it, like some lines that go towards the center. So I'm going to try to do some essentially almost stippling. I just ended up stippling, just put bunch of little dots over the light blue. And my black's already drying up here. Now I'm going to go back in and put the pupil. So essentially just a small black circle in the middle of the eye. Now, if you want to get even a little bit next level, and put a small reflection dot on the eye. So usually this works best just to the side, just kind of like the upper corner of where the black is. Or, you know, just cover up the whole black. That's clean those up a little bit. We'll also put the little white dots on Hamish. This brush is giving me a little bit of trouble. It's got like a stray hair on it that's messing with me. All right, so once that's done, we're gonna take, you can do black for this. I think at this scale, the black will probably look a little off. So I'm going to use Indian Shadow. So this is just a dark red flesh color. substitute of it, it would just kind of be a brownish red or reddish brown. You could take a dark red and just add a touch of dark brown to it if you need to make something similar to it. Color that's kind of like it, P3's Sanguine Base is kind of close to it, maybe just a touch darker. Again, whatever paint line you're using is fine. I can't always necessarily recommend the paint color, but if you can just look at what I'm using and find whatever the closest approximation to that is. All right, so what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to outline his eye. So I sometimes talk about this almost like you're painting negative space when you're doing eyes this way, because you're really not, as opposed to having everything painted and trying to paint the eye inside of all the stuff you're painting, you're like painting in the inside part and you're working your way out so that you don't have to be careful. You only have to be careful on one side of the eye. So you can see, like, I don't even care. I'll paint his face. It doesn't matter to me. So as you paint, you really only have to be careful about going up to one side of his eye. The other side you don't have to worry about at all. So as you're doing this, it's best to kind of start from further away than you think you might need to, and kind of slowly move your brush in as you make your strokes so that you are finding the exact right spot where the eye starts, as opposed to just guessing and starting right where you think it should be, and if it's too far inside, you just end up painting right over all your hard work. He doesn't look so crazy anymore. I mean, it is Mel Gibson, so there's always going to be a little bit of crazy. Or a lot of crazy, I guess, in his case. He has kind of gone off the deep end. So later on, when I'm doing the finishing touches on this guy. There's a couple little spots on the eye that I think I might touch up, but for the most part I'm happy with how that came out. Hamish is the same way. And like I said, for the last two statues, last two busts, I'll eventually show you how to do those eyes if you want to do them later. It's up to you. I think this is a much easier time to paint the eyes. As I've said before, the only problem is you just have to be more careful while you're doing the rest of the face. So there we go. Even just the black looks good. If you can get the tiny little white dots on there, it makes it even look a little bit better. But you can see they're already pretty convincing eyes, and it hasn't been that difficult of a journey so far. So the last thing that I want you to do before we get to the first day where we're all doing a paint together, which by the way, I'm filming this video on June 2nd. It'll probably be mid to late June, so probably 2 or 3 weeks from now is when we'll all get started. I want two things. I want everybody to have a chance who really wants to get on board with this to get their models. Some got shipped to Europe, and those can take a couple weeks, so I wanted to make sure everybody has a chance. But also, my work schedule has been really, really crazy lately, and it's likely to still be for another week or two. So I just want to make sure that my stuff calms down so that I don't end up canceling our painting sessions once we get them all scheduled. I would hate to have you set aside time to paint with me and then I cancel on you. So I want to make sure those are set in stone. So the last thing I want you to do is I want you to base coat the skin. So I'm going to use basic flesh for that from Scale Color. It's just kind of a nice, slightly darker flesh tone. Sometimes I'll base with basic flesh. Sometimes I base with Resurrection Flesh, which is a fantasy and games color by Scale Color. You can see that the Resurrection Flesh is slightly pinker, just a little bit more pink to it, a little more red to it. Other than that, they're pretty close in terms of being mid-tone skins, slightly on the darker side. Just for if you're looking at, again, I don't have a lot of paints by other paint lines at this point, especially not flesh tones. But if you're just kind of comparing it, this is Kislev Flesh from Games Workshop. You can see that what I have here is just a little bit, again, less pink and a little bit darker. If you have Kislev Flesh and that's kind of what you feel like is maybe your most mid-tone flesh color, you can always add just the barest hint of like a forest green to it, like really just a tiny amount. And maybe even just a tiny bit of dark brown. Something like that might help to desaturate this a little bit and get closer to the basic flesh, if you want to copy me exactly. We're going to end up doing, or at least for my models, I'm going to be doing some glazings and stuff. And so if you're with me for this ride and you want to try all the techniques that I'm showing, we're going to end up doing glazing later that's going to help to tone anything that we're using. So you could even just use straight Kislev Flesh, it would be okay. But you might want to start with something slightly less saturated and a little, just a hair darker. And one of the things with base coating, as I'm sure you've seen everywhere, especially, Games Workshop's painter, Duncan, is famous for saying, 2 thin coats is better than 1 thick coat. So you want to get your paint slightly thinned, just to kind of show you how thin mine is. It should take you a couple passes. So as I'll show you on this model. So I start to put it on. The coverage is okay, but you can definitely see the primer below it. I'm going to go right up to the eye. I'm going to leave a little bit of the dark red right next to the eye. And then I'm just going to coat everything. Yeah, I'm essentially just gonna coat the entire model, go back, do a second coat, do a third coat if I need to, until it's a nice smooth layer of skin. So I'm gonna finish up. It's gonna go all the way around his forehead, under his neck, down his V-line, and I don't think he has any on other parts of his body. But yeah, so get to that point before we start to paint. So if you want the eyes painted ahead of time, use that technique to finish the eyes off and then paint all the skin around it. If you're just gonna paint along with me on these other models that I'll do the eyes later, you don't have to worry about those yet, and get your base coat of your flesh all down so that when we all start together in a couple weeks time, we can all start with working up on our highlights and texturing for our skin. So I really am looking forward to this journey with you. I hope you are too. During the course of painting these together, what I think would be really cool is if we share what we're doing on social media in terms of, if there's a bunch of us painting these models, we can all help each other out. So you're like, oh, I tried what he was showing and this is what it came out to be. We can comment and say, well, I think maybe this was what was wrong, or, help you out. And also just be able to show stuff off. I'd love to, at the end of every session, or even at the beginning of every session, kind of say, hey, this is the pictures people sent me of where they're at after the last session, and now here's what we're going to do from here. And I might even be able to give you a couple pointers at that point if you're showing me some things and saying, I'm not sure why I did this or something like that. But anyway, I'm looking forward to this. If you know other people who you think might enjoy doing this paint along as well, please let them know. It would really help me out. Again, like I said, this is a great way to help support me and the things that I do. The models aren't super expensive, but I mean, it did cost me some money to get them made. So if you can help me get them sold, it helps me a little bit. Just like with other things, I give 25% of the money that I take into charity. So 25% of the money that I get from these busts goes to charitable causes. So also helping out a good cause. So spread the word, get your models ready. I look forward to taking this journey with you. We'll see you next time.